recording this sample class. Off chance anybody gets in touch with me and says, "Oh, I wanted to attend," so I could send them a link. So for people who have been taking this class for a while, this will stand as basic review, some brief, but also maybe a little bit of general discussion of this type of practice. It's the sort of peculiar challenges of naming that at least I find around it. And, some of the potential goals. Start from the basics. Just think about sitting. In this class, typically we'll do seated exercises, also standing exercises, some reclining, which we didn't do much of this summer, but integrate, move forward with the class, and then we've done the walking exercise as well, simple walking exercises, which in Chinese sometimes referred to as the four treasures of the body, which is a little bit similar to in terms of name, to the three treasures. So these four treasures just sort of refer to the basic activities, the basic virtues or abilities of the body. And there are other things that might have been included, say kneeling, although I think the Chinese typically consider kneeling a type of sitting. And there are even crawling exercises that you see sometimes, not part of this practice in particular, but they seem to be enjoying quite a renaissance recently. People are doing all sorts of crawling exercises all over the internet all of a sudden. It's interesting to me. The three treasures refer to something quite different, which are Jing, Qi, and Shen. This is a very old idea in Chinese practice and may in fact stem from Taoism. So while people are always claiming that everything is Taoist that comes out of China, including all of Chinese medicine, et cetera, I think some of these arguments are a little exaggerated. The concept of Jing, Qi, and Shen definitely have a very good chance of being Taoist in origin, not Qi per se, as that's a very old and large idea emerging from sort of Chinese culture in some larger sense, and certainly predating Taoism. Shen, the idea of spirit or divinity, is certainly, of course, even older. And the idea that human beings have some kind of spirit or Shen, it's hard to trace exactly when that term was applied to human beings. Jing seems to be perhaps a more innovative term in this context. And the idea of wrapping them all together in a kind of continuum also seems to be sort of a Taoist innovation. And so what are they? Well, in some senses, we could say they're all forms of Qi. Because starting in the Song Dynasty, 1,000 years ago or so, Qi became cemented as the fundamental ontology or cosmology of everything in traditional Chinese culture. Everything was a form of Qi. Qi is the prime mover and initiator of everything that comes to be in the world. In a more specific sense, in terms of meditation and related ideas in medical practice, Qi is the prime mover of the body and all the body's physiological processes, but also, to some degree, all its mental processes. And there we find some overlap with the idea of Shen, which has both the sense of spirit, the divine sense, or it's the nuministic sense, but also associated with the mind. And I think in many cultures, the differentiation between the mind and the spirit is quite challenging. In the modern world, we've moved largely to a mind-centered model, away from spirit is something differentiated from mind in some way. But in the context of qi, we can think of spirit as an especially refined state quality of qi. And this way, it's kind of materialistic. These things are all referred to traditionally often as substances. Meaning they're material, they're matter, they're very subtle or fine matter. And this is part of the way in which they're prime movers. And Jing is, if Shen is an especially refined quality of qi, then Jing in some ways is slightly less. When we're talking about 3 levels this way, Jing is perhaps the most substantial, the closest to the kind of matter we sort of normally experience, but still more refined than the flesh and bone of the body, more subtle. And in the early writings, also clearly, every bit is sort of nuministic. It's much a sort of divine, spiritual substance as Shen. It's described in these terms. It's pure and bright, close to the foundation of life. Shen is that which perhaps is most obviously expressed outward into the world through our posture, our voice, the glow of our face, the brightness of the eyes, any number of cues. Qi is a bit more subtle and hidden. Generally, to determine a person's quality of qi often requires kind of skills developed by a doctor. Though even here, some things overlap, like the quality of the voice. When the voice is weak, it may be a sign that the lung qi is also weak. And Jing, deeper still. So while more materialistic, and you might think to some degree more tangible or more easily observable, it's actually associated with a deeper level of organization in the body, and something that's perhaps harder to see in and of itself, though its product is often easily visible. And Jing often associated with both procreation and the ability to procreate entity, but also aging. So normal development in children, and then the aging process as we grow older. And people who are aging seemingly especially quickly, well, that's a very easily observable lack of Jing, seen in things like the hair, the teeth, memory, their mental functions, in the bones themselves. This is to metaphilize it, to put it in the medical context, considerably in the early sort of meditational tradition of Taoism. Taoism seems to have originated primarily as a set of meditation techniques, and it's somewhat ecstatic, or as some people would call them, ecstatic. Ecstatic implies the spirit is leaving the body, whereas ecstatic practices would be things where we move deeper into our own body. And whatever conclusions about the deeper nature of the world around us that can be derived from meditation, which is not something I'm as particularly interested in. I'm more interested in the experience in and of itself, and to some degree, because of my background, that slightly medicalized context, or therapeutic, we might say, it's less highfalutin process of maintaining health and exploring personal experience, hopefully enriching it. And in this way, improving our relationship with the outer world, rather than drawing deep conclusions per se about how the outer world must in some way mirror these internal experiences. And so what does this have to do with how we sit? Well, if the spirit shows forth in partly our posture, because of a kind of feedback loop between every substance, every process of the body, how we sit is also going to affect potentially the spirit. And so the first thing that we discover is that it's important to sit tall and erect, but also relaxed. And the same process we would go through in standing postures that people here, or we discuss more than once, is very helpful in the seated position, though we can kind of reverse engineer it, move sometimes up through the body rather than down through it, in a way that's productive and throws a little light on the downward movement as well. So being able to move up through the body or down through the body, it makes us a little more flexible, helps us maybe get through some sticking points. And the reason that moving up through the body is so helpful when we're sitting is because our weight's sitting on our pelvis. And the way in which we sit is going to have the biggest effect on postural support. And so head carriage is definitely good for adjusting things. And maybe by floating the head back and the crown and the head up, I can correct much of my seated posture, and I certainly feel adjusting a lot, but perhaps mostly because I've spent so much time doing these things. It's often a little easier to get in touch with the feeling by thinking about exactly where on the sit bones we are sitting. And we can just experiment a little bit by rolling forward the front of the sit bones, which curves my lower back, rolls the upper hip bones a little forward, anterior tilt, and backward into posterior tilt. And noticing the overall changes that take place in the body. So especially when I roll onto the back of the sit bones, tailbones are rolling under the body, upper hip bones are rolling backward, and I start to feel my lower back curving forward, reflection. And I'll notice that as that happens, how my head sinks a little bit. And I perhaps start to sag a little. And I feel like all my weight sitting now on my pelvis, very little is conveyed down through my legs and to my feet. And the overall feeling is a little bit of perhaps tired, almost a sort of depressive sort of experience. It's like imitating depression just through the posture. Think of it like method acting. And then releasing up through the spine a little bit as I come back through the center. Noticing, can I feel that lift? Just naturally pushing up through the spine, up through the crown of the head. And that, in fact, that floating back of the chin and the lift up through the crown may happen automatically. So when standing, I often emphasize head carriage and then letting the tailbone drop under, finding the correct pelvic tilt very spontaneously from the top down. Here we can do it from the opposite direction. And I also notice my legs feel a little different. Right? My legs don't feel quite as slack and disengaged, but I start to feel my legs wake up. I may even feel just a little bit of weight in my feet. They start to feel like they're part of this relaxed support network of the whole body. And then if I roll forward a little further, deepening that crease of the hips, curving the lower back inward now. This doesn't produce a sagging posture, but some degree starts to make my chest feel a little bit thrown up and outward in a way that feels slightly awkward. My back starts to feel a little tight and closed. My shoulder blades are moving together. My head's back at least, but it's hard to drop my chin in this position, so it's hard to lengthen the back of the neck and to feel that lift up through the crown. Let's relax back from that slightly, and I still can feel quite erect and well supported, but I don't have that slightly overfilled sense of the chest, the slight stiffness of the neck and back, right? Even the shoulders feel thrown back slightly. And I would say this is much closer to what has often been sort of recommended in terms of Western posture for people, so people avoid slumping. But from a Chinese point of view, it's equally exaggerated to this posture. It's in the opposite direction. So we can think of it as much too young. And so in this position, what do I feel? It's the quality of spirit, subjective affect. Well, it feels a little rigid, it feels a little full and forceful, might feel slightly belligerent or overly proud. Is it overall quality perhaps of a little tightness and even some slight stuffiness to the movement of the breath in the chest. I might still be able to breathe kind of deeply, but I feel some sense of restriction, or at least some slight lack of ease. And when I relax back to that middle position, flow of the breath down into the abdomen will tend to feel much more full. The overall affect is much lighter, neither exaggerated in a progressive stance, or collapsed into a depressive stance. Again, I may feel my head just retracting a little bit, the head floating back, but without the chin lifted, nor dropped too far. Nice and neutral. As I do this, I may even feel like my jaw can relax forward a little bit, especially if I have a bit of an overbite, so that my teeth line up. A bit more easily. I may feel that natural lift of the tongue up to the roof of the mouth, just the tip. Very gentle, very easy. An inch or so back from the upper teeth. You may feel the area around the mouth both relaxed and slightly waking up, as if I was just about to smile, not quite getting there. And even the area around the eyes relaxing and softening and helping me soften my gaze a little bit, not staring at any one point. Now, if you're watching a small screen, that's not so helpful with these practices. So since there's so little to see in what I'm doing here, the verbal cues are perhaps more useful than the visual ones, and we don't have to stare at the screen. Perhaps the biggest negative in Zoom classes. Really noticing that relationship between affect, the subjective feeling of being, and our posture. In terms of stimulating this deep support, especially in the lumbar and pelvic region, that's seen at that lower fundamental level of organization, chin, helping to build the kidney system, the bones. We get a sense of free movement of the breath. And for the moment, maybe we'll just leave that as our definition of qi. Feel like the breath can move freely throughout the chest and abdominal cavities. not just upper and lower, but also front and back, listening for a little feeling of movement in the back as well. We can consider Shen at the moment quite close to this simple sense of affect, attitude, also awareness. These are the ways in which heart or mind, Shin, overlap with spirit, Shen, in the Chinese system. Much more in common with one another than difference. In fact, in the sense that Shin, X-I-N, Romanized spelling, is the heart. The heart feels gently enclosed by the shape of the body. And as the head floats back and up, the upper back lifts and spreads, the shoulders broaden a little bit, and it feels like the outer surfaces, especially the back of the body, the outer arms, flanks, gently wrapping around and enclosing the inner surfaces, including the front, especially the more central area of the chest and abdomen. The heart sitting at the chest center, even if it's a little lopsided, you really need to worry about that. It doesn't sit perfectly symmetrically. This is kind of incidental. It's right on top of the diaphragm, and so as I feel the area of the sternum, the breastbone, sort of gently sinking in, though not collapsing down, feel these outer surfaces gently unfold again. You start to look for a sense of deep release down through the body, down through the core. And typically in this kind of practice where eyes aren't open wide and staring, I already talked about softening the vision. You can even allow the eyes to become a little heavy lidded. Sometimes the exercises are done with the eyes closed. I think initially it's often useful to do them half closed, as keeping your eyes just a little bit open really helps with our awareness of our posture and our position of our body in space, environment around us. Sometimes the half-lidded position is described as a good intermingling of yin and yang, right? Wide open would be yang, closed would be yin. This is a bit of an admixture. Help harmonize those qualities in the body. Alertness, support, active awareness, with relaxation, softness, sinking of the weight, release of any tension, and more passive awareness. This brings us to another really important set of qualities in these overall kinds of practices. That we might in the West term as meditation, but they are much broader than that. In the Chinese context, they include a lot of different kinds of active exercises. Active awareness, where I'm really particularly listening for certain qualities or listening to particular areas of the body. And perhaps moving my attention through different areas systematically to check in. As opposed to passive awareness, where I let that kind of intentionality drop away. I'm not pursuing particular qualities, not necessarily asking myself questions about my posture or my breath, state, and how important both of these things are, and how different exercises or even different phases of the same exercise will emphasize one over another. And that one is much easier to discuss than the other. The active kind of awareness and intentionality, much easier to discuss, because as we start to discuss the more passive quality, we risk making it too active. And in the series I taught this summer, I found myself in the early classes pointing out the moments where we pursue, see even there, not an apt word choice, but where we are sort of moving into more passive states and thinking about how challenging it is, particularly I think in this distance context, at least for me, to feel like that kind of moment is conveying a sustained where we're all in faraway places. And finding myself over the course of the summer focusing more and more on very active practices. Leaving some time, but perhaps never quite enough for the kind of passive development, passive awareness that ideally sort of brackets the active things. So for instance, once I've set up my posture and checked in and perhaps started to scan the body, perhaps from top down for any excess tension that I might be able to release through small postural adjustments, noticing the quality, the depth of the breath, its rate, parts of the body it reaches if it's not reach, the relationship between the quality and shape of this breath and my posture, weight of the feet on the floor becomes more substantial as the posture improves, release tension down. The weight of my palms, the fingers resting on the thighs. A little bit, I can take a holiday from all of those things. Sometimes this means the mind will wander on something not pertinent, just sitting, what's happened during the day, or what has happened the following day, or whatnot. Other times, our attention just soften, become non-specific. Sense of general awareness will be maintained to help keep those other things gently at bay, at least relatively quiet. Even to make any effort to quiet those distracting voices, images in our mind is far too active. And so when they arise, we don't worry about it. And after a time, when they fade or quiet, even then, I don't think, glad that's good. As things rise and fall, I'm not too concerned. Generally aware of these things without attaching any particular importance or significance to them, one way or another. One of the reasons I think I find challenging, particularly to teach this sort of practice on Zoom, is that in a room you can sort of read the room, even when you're not really looking at people. You have a sense of feeling when people are in that comfortable space, and as people start to get a little bit tired, distracted or restless, and notice it relatively quickly, and you think, now it's time to move on. Of course, doesn't happen to everybody exactly the same time, but it always reaches a natural tipping point which guides the class pacing. I'm sitting alone in a room. If I'm very comfortable, it would be very easy for me to sit this way quite a long time, saying very little. And that voice comes to the back of my head, oh yes, I'm teaching a class. Seems to always trouble me a little less than the person. Say we are getting a little restless because perhaps sitting is not entirely comfortable. So rather than grinning and bearing it, it makes more sense to try to alleviate any stiffness, tension, discomfort we feel. In Chinese medicine, any tension we feel is a lack of movement. Some obstacle, obstruction, or slowing of the circulation in a particular area that then evokes the sensation of pain or discomfort. I can bow forward a little bit. From the top down, slowly rolling through the spine. Not overly bending at the neck or at the waist. Think about the upper back and use that as a guide for how much bending should be in any part of the body, including the lower back. And then when I get to the hips can really bend as deeply as it's comfortable. I don't need to worry about overdoing it there. Leading a rolling movement from the top down. This is complementary to that bottom up through the spine that we began with. And then I start to lift the head gently, not craning the neck too much, just a gentle extension back in the neck, and then the upper back, and then the lower back. Rising up, the movement again rolls from the top down through the body. Very gentle, no extreme bends. Not all the way down, not all the way up. A very even wave-like feeling through every part of the spine. I can turn a little bit, even that turning can be from the top down. And then again, initiate another bow forward, but over one leg. Swaying through the middle. Rising up on the other side. Pause at the top. And then reverse. There's no set rate for this. Moving relatively slowly, but that feels too slow to you. Words go a little quicker. The rest should just be comfortable, deep, slow. If it falls in time of the movement, great, not fine. Back to just sitting. I skipped over some of the basic details of sitting. I'm sitting close to the edge. If I was in a chair toward the front. On a stool, it's relatively easy. No way to sit back on a stool. And the seat needs to be at the height of my knees or slightly higher. So my knee is never higher than my hip. My feet are positioned about hips width apart, with the ankles right under the knees. So I have something like a right angle at the ankle, at the knee, and at the hip. And the spine is nice and vertical and straight. To some degree, we look like the Chinese character zheng, which means correct or upright. The idea that when the body posture is correct and upright, then slowly the qi will become so as well. The circulation, physiological processes, even the ordering of the mind. If we look at this funny word alchemy for a moment, in Chinese the word is dan, which refers to the elixir vitae, the transformative elixir. That was the goal of many alchemical formulas. The Chinese rather unique interpretation of alchemy was that one did not have to necessarily go pursuing it through compounding metals and such in flasks and heating them and trying to refine these chemical states. But since the macrocosm, the outer world, was fully realized also within the microcosm, the body, all these elements must exist within, and one could do these alchemical procedures internally. We don't necessarily have to take the search for immortality particularly literally. In fact, some famous Taoists, one in particular, one of the most famous writers in all of Taoism, Chuang-Tzu, mocks such ideas. He might have been sympathetic to the experience of immortality in the present moment. The idea of trying to live longer than your allotted time. He quite explicitly mocked his writings. Foundation model for the internal alchemical process is the refinement of internal substances, as if they were the equivalent of mercury, so prized by alchemists, and the transformation of base substances into refined ones. not much discussion of gold in internal alchemy, but the same kinds of processes and the same metaphors of refinement of fires exist. The idea of refining Jing essence into more subtle Qi, and then refining that more subtle Qi into yet more subtle Shen, spirit, and then refining that subtle Shen and spirit into something even more numinous and transcendental, which might be termed emptiness, empty of any kind of form, nameable quality. Refers to some degree to perhaps states of meditational experience. Placed into a context of something like physiological changes. The place where these transformations happen, or the places are centered within the body along the sort of core avenue of communication, up from the perineum, along the front of the spine, all the way to the crown of the head. The three particular centers, one in the lower pelvic region, one around the area of the diaphragm and below the heart, and one center of the head. Some degree imitates the heaven, earth, and human levels of the traditional worldview. We can pursue these more actively through formulaic recipes, transformation, and signs of reaching certain levels of progress, or one can let them sort of percolate along more passively, or some combination of the two. We assume that these kinds of transformative states are to some degree native to the body, and they don't need to be focused too hard. Sometimes very small adjustments to our posture have very interesting effects throughout the entire microcosm of the body. So, for instance, sinking the weight through the balls of the feet. You get a subtly different support in the legs, through the hips, and back. Rather than you lifting the heels in any way that might be awkward or forced or difficult to sustain, rather think of sinking the weight through the balls of the feet and toes so the heels just become light. Our attention initially is on that lower elixir field, the lower dantian, directly in communication with the kidneys, the deepest root of the body, as well as the earth below us, with the legs. Noticing any change to the contour of the breath. letting the heels slowly sink down. The change can even be that you feel a little extra stress in some way, which is less than ideal, but something worth noticing, or that I feel perhaps some relief as the support changes. Some part of the body relaxes, opens up, it's working so hard. Now we'll sink the weight through the heels. See if we can get the ball of the foot, toes, front of the feet to rise up off the floor. Trying to avoid too strenuous a contraction in the shins. And then reconsider my head posture even a little bit to relieve any extra tension that's arisen. You notice perhaps that the heels up brought some particular attention to the back of the body. Having the balls of the feet lifted seems to have a stronger effect on the front of the body. Perhaps we feel it different. Noticing again the differences in change of support, the contour of the breath, even the overall affect, sensibility. Sink evenly through the feet again. The whole body adjusts in response. It's overwhelmingly typical to refer to this lowest burner, this lowest heat source, alchemical fire in the lower abdomen. You do occasionally see it referred to as being the feet, the soles of the feet, in which case the middle burner moves down to the abdominal region, perhaps behind the navel. There's no one single model for these kinds of practices. Everything's contextual. Feet feel quite different after having done those two postures. And the sense of communication between my feet, lower abdominal region, back. Bow forward. Through and up. Once, twice, 3 times. And agree, just be guided by what it feels like I need to do. Relaxing that active kind of noticing. Seeing what's left. Palms together. Possibly quite warm already from resting on the legs. Active. Place them over the eyes and just let the warmth of the palms sink in. Keeping the shoulders relaxed, but also maintaining the head carriage. Pushing up to the forehead, and down the side of the face. The channels of the face are called yang ming, and they're especially full of blood and qi, and massage of the face is like a massage of all the yang channels of the body, helping get things moving that might be overly full, stagnating. In that sense that the more substantive or physiological sense of circulation leads over into affect, into the other kinds of experiential qualities associated perhaps with the mind, emotions. Check the time. Still haven't got my clock to hang on the wall in place, but yeah, pretty good. 5 minutes. Of course, many, many other exercises and massages we might do. So, cool. Dredging of the scalp. I have to say that passive, more sedentary exercises like this are often very good before bed, but people are quite different. Some of these, for some people, these kinds of things would be very energizing. We find it's harder to get to sleep after this sort of thing, better to do it earlier in the day. Covering the ears, tapping at the base of the head. And that light percussion again. Shake things up, release any excess tension, head and down through the neck. Turning the head, pulling the neck gently back front. The other side. cupping the hand, reaching over, half the base of the neck area, just below the seventh cervical vertebra. Then one other that often we do towards the beginning of this kind of practice, it's very useful for getting that sense of the deeper connection down through the chest, of swirling the tongue around the teeth, usually the outer teeth and gums, swirling around. If we build up any saliva, just holding it for a moment. If we don't, that's fine. Knocking the teeth together lightly. Slow motion chattering. Again, to let that vibration relax the jaw and even more of head, neck, throat, and then swallowing, even if there's nothing particularly to swallow, and just following that sensation down deeply through the body. Sense of peristalsis in the esophagus, giving way to something more subtle as we move past the diaphragm that continues to descend down into the lower abdomen. Sense perhaps a deep relaxation from that deep descending motion. Ultimately, may yield some subtle sense of fullness or warmth down in the lower abdomen. In one direction, I can go back in the other. Moving our attention relatively slowly down through the body. And then when it's time to rise up, shifting the weight just a little bit forward into the legs. Keeping the chin in, crown up. And rising up as smoothly and slowly as we can. Finding that fold, flexion in the hips, sitting back just a little bit, softening the knees. Same head carriage, releasing out through the shoulders and arms. We'll rock the weight a little bit side to side. Here, not emphasizing so much the sinking down into the heavy leg, but the freeing up of the light leg. As we move to something a little less sedentary and rooted. But eventually I can sort of walk my feet together. We're relatively close. And walking in place, let the arms swing in the normal counterbalanced pattern. Walking gently in place. If I can maintain the basic posture still a little bit, spread the palms slightly, drop the tailbone. Continue to let the breast sink down into the abdomen all the better. trying to find as natural a rhythm as possible. Be easy, light, free. You can say carefree. Certainly do quite a bit more of that, but got in for a lot of time. It's will not shake out. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask.